Welcome to The Expert View. I'm Siobhan Creaton, and today I'm joined by Professor Mary Horgan, President of the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland and a consultant in infectious diseases at Cork University Hospital. Professor Mary Horgan, thank you very much for joining us today. Everybody is looking forward to your expertise, your expert view on COVID-19, the only topic in town. So today I have some questions from your colleagues in the college. When will it all end? Will it all end? How will we all be at the end of it? So thank you very much for sharing your time and your expertise with us. So, Mary, if I could ask you first of all, when you started out in infectious diseases back in the day, did you ever think we'd be living through a pandemic?
Absolutely not. My interest in infectious diseases started in about 1984 when I was in college, and I really liked microbiology. And around that time was the start of HIV/AIDS. And I just always had an interest in infectious diseases and went to the States in 1990. At that time, the big epidemic was HIV/AIDS. And we all heard and learned about the flu pandemic of 1918, 1919. And in actual fact, my granduncle died from it. I hadn't known that until recently. But that seemed like, oh my God, so long ago. We're so sophisticated, nothing like this could ever happen us. Most people will remember the flu pandemic of 09-10, which was the swine flu pandemic. Yeah, it affected us, but we knew a vaccine would come. We always know flu was seasonal, so that it was going to peter out. And all of a sudden, in early January, I was at a big infectious disease. Well, it wasn't big, but we were organizing the big European meeting. And I said to my colleague, and I clearly remember it on the 8th of January, what's the story with this virus? I said, I got a few alerts, this disease that's out in China. And she said, well, we think it's a coronavirus. That's as much as we know. That was the 8th of January. And where are we now? On the 23rd of April. And it's like the world has changed. While we were getting reports, I kept on saying, God, there's 1.3 billion people in China. What is the big deal? It's only 100,000. We've seen this before with SARS and with other influenzas coming from there. And then all of a sudden it started going to a few different countries. Well, it was first reported human to human. Then it started happening in Singapore and in Korea and in Thailand. There were a few cases. And then I suppose the first time that really fear set in, from my point of view, when Italy happened, have vivid recollections of army trucks bringing loads of coffins away, and it just seems surreal. Like, this is Italy, this is near us, and then I won't say the rest is history, but all of a sudden I think people started saying, yeah, this is on our doorstep. This is in Europe. This is not a third world developing country problem. This is on our doorstep. And did I ever think we'd be really looking at what you feel like you're part of a movie? I don't know if anyone has that sensation, but it's like, oh my God, like we're, restrictions in place, afraid to go out, trying to mind older people, a new story every day, trying to decipher all the science, what works, what doesn't, where we're at. So, totally changed how we live, and in actual fact, totally changed how we work, and for many, losing their jobs, which maybe short term, maybe long term, we don't know.
It's really a very unusual time, and I think people are scared and they're overwhelmed by all of the information that's coming at them all the time. There's a few questions in just about the virus itself. There seems to be some question about when you have it. Like, some people may have it, is that right? And have no symptoms. Some people may have it. So that's the danger, because you don't know when you're transmitting it and when you're passing it on.
So there's so much unpredictable about this virus, something I've never seen before. So when it comes to how people present with it, as you said, a lot of people have no symptoms at all. A lot of people can spread it and then get symptoms about 48 hours later. And we see that in a lot of infections like chickenpox and measles, where people are infectious before they develop the symptoms. And then thankfully about 80% have mild symptoms if they get it, but about 20% of people have more severe symptoms, and many of whom require hospitalization. And when I say it's unpredictable, it's like we don't know who the 80% that have mild infection. We can't predict who they are. We can't predict who the 20% will have severe infection. If we could do that, we could manage it easier, especially for those people most at risk. We just don't know. From a public health point of view, it's always very difficult to control infections like that, because if you've got a proportion, and Professor Philip Nolan said it was up to 30% who've no symptoms at all, so they go around not knowing they have it and unknowingly spread it. And from a public health infectious disease point of view, those type of infections are really, really hard to control. So it's unpredictable in many ways. And then the other part that's unpredictable, when you end up in a hospital, and thankfully, again, this is the minority of patients, people can get sick all of a sudden. And again, we can't predict who that small minority are who end up in the intensive care unit requiring more oxygen. So there's so much unpredictability about it. But my hope is that the more we know about it, the more information we share across different countries, the more research we do into it, the quicker we'll be able to answer a lot of those questions, particularly how we can identify those really most at risk. And that's not just vulnerable populations. That's people like you and me who, for some reason, can get a worse case of it.
I suppose worryingly, the WHO came out this week and said that there was no evidence that if you had got it, that you had an immunity, which I thought in the initial phases, at least, people thought there was some immunity to this. That's worrying, isn't it?
Well, one thing I would say is the absence of evidence doesn't mean evidence of absence. And this highlights the importance of research in the area. They said there was no evidence of immunity, but saying that there aren't studies that actually determine that. Most times when we get infection, we get immunity. I suppose the big question is how robust it is. In other words, how strong that immunity is. And secondly, how long it lasts. With coronaviruses, and there are two, and people will have heard of SARS, and there's another one, MERS-CoV, that have happened in the early 2003 and 2011. We know from that immunity seems to last for 2 to 3 years. All we can say is comparatively, you might say, well, the same may apply for SARS-CoV-2, or which causes COVID-19, which is the disease the virus causes. But again, I wouldn't be doom and gloom. I would say we need to study it. We need to know, do you produce antibodies? If you do, are they high enough to protect you? And how long that protection lasts? And we don't have the answers to that yet.
So presumably it's very scary if you end up being a patient in hospital, for example, or even if you get COVID and you're managing it at home, to think that you could potentially get it again.
Yeah, I mean, it's not what you want to hear. As I said, something like chickenpox, if you get it, you really pretty much only get it once. Likewise with measles and that. So there is comfort in, having gone through a serious illness that you recover, you never get it again. And patients like to hear that, and they like to be reassured. At the moment, we cannot give that reassurance. But I would say that when we really know about that is if there's a second little wave or ripple. We talk about the surge, we've avoided that, we've had a small wave. When the next wave comes, we'll have more information about that, because we'll see if people who've had it before showing up to hospitals, and if they do, then that's a big issue.
And we've heard a lot about flattening this curve, reducing, which is to reduce the peak and take the pressure off the hospitals. But effectively, the same amount of people are still going to get sick, aren't they? It's just over a longer period of time.
That's right. Social distancing is to protect our health service. If you didn't have that, you'd be absolutely overwhelmed with the number of patients coming into hospital, and particularly those requiring ventilators. Now, you could have the whole hospital just with COVID, but within that, the ventilator situation is an absolute requirement. And if you have too many patients coming in, that's what would happen.
but potentially then we're going to still live with a lot of people who are going to have COVID.
Yes, so one of the strategies that the government can use is gradually reduce the restrictions that have been put on us by having smaller groups, or you might be able to travel a little bit further away from that 2-kilometre radius. Monitor the hospital activity really closely. If they find out that 50% of the ventilator beds are being used, then they'd bring in restrictions again. So it'll be this kind of wave of, monitoring hospital activity. When it gets busier, you bring in restrictions, then you release them again. So small little waves all the time.
So even if they do liberate us to some degree, it's probably only a free pass for a short while, that they could bring it back in again, depending on how the numbers perform in the hospitals.
Yeah. And really, it'll depend on the hospital activity, because the hospital activity is the best indicator of severity of disease. So when you hear the chief medical officer speaking about the numbers, the key numbers to look at are the number of hospitalizations and the number of people on ventilators. The other numbers, and obviously, the poor people who die and where they pass on from. But the number of positive tests really is only an indicator of the number of people who are tested. So the more you test, the more positives you're going to have. But really looking at what's key to our health service and protecting the populations is the utilisation of hospital and hospital admissions.
So when you're dealing with patients in CUH at the moment, what are the typical questions that they're asking you about? I guess it's to do with immunity, but what other concerns do they have?
You're absolutely right. The first question they will ask, will this happen to me again? And I think it's such a frightening experience for them. They're very short of breath. Some of them end up in the intensive care unit, and the last thing they want to do is get this again. I've been kind of saying we're hoping that they become immune, but we don't know for certain yet, and time will tell. What else do they're worried about passing it on to their families, and we reassure them. Often they're in the hospital for 2 weeks anyway, so by the time they're finished, we'd swab them and they'd be negative, and then we can send them home. They worry whether their lungs have been damaged long term, and would this be a problem in 10 years time. We don't think it is, but we don't know for certain. And I suppose they want to know how quickly we can get both a treatment and a vaccine, because they don't want other people, their immediate family, their community, to have the experience that they have.
Yeah. The WHO has said, that testing is the way to go on this, but we seem to have had a lot of challenges to ramp up the testing sufficiently. Obviously, the labs are coming more on stream. They seem to have more capacity. But is it realistic to expect to be able to test an entire population all the time if we're living with this virus?
Testing is really important for containment of the infection, so it's kind of a different question than I answered about hospitalizations. The benefit of test is you identify cases, you isolate them and isolate their contacts. That's essentially, so you're containing the infection. And in an ideal world, you would test the whole of the population and you could effectively eliminate it from Ireland. The challenges in Ireland, though, are we have one island with 2 jurisdictions, so 2 different policies. So that's an issue. And secondly, even if we found out in the morning that every single person in the country didn't have COVID-19, that's fine if we don't leave the country or people don't come into it. When we leave, we'd have restrictions placed on us. And if people come in, they can bring the infection with them. And that's happened recently in Singapore, where they've seen an upswing in the infection. So yes, it is theoretically possible to eliminate the infection, but we wouldn't be going anywhere.
It is really all about learning to live with it. And you can see that Austria and Denmark and Germany to some degree have begun to open shops and loosen the restrictions a bit. Are they going to provide us with some good information in terms of how we might approach it, given that we're a few weeks behind them?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I suppose when you look at Denmark, they had about a third to half of the cases that we had, so it was a little easier for them to remove the restrictions. So I have a few comments about that. Absolutely, we learned from them because they're doing it now about 3 weeks ahead of us. Secondly, I think it's kind of important not to compare countries because we live so differently. Geographical space, rural versus urban, how we managed our restrictions, how we count the number of people who died from it is quite different from country to country, and how some countries can bring in strict restrictions because they're police societies, and that's just the way it is, whether, that's the way people live. So I always caution about comparing countries, because everyone says, oh, New Zealand is perfect, or, Singapore is perfect, or Germany. I think it's too early to tell how perfect they were. The issues in Southern Hemisphere where they're just going into their winter when we typically see these. So, are they doing brilliantly? Maybe they are, but, they're a very isolated island. We're a very connected island. Mm. What we will learn from Europe, I think, is if they start seeing increased cases at the end of next week, just before we start doing it, then, it's a little worrying. I think and I hope that they'll start removing some restrictions. We know that no person under the age of 20 has been hospitalized in that. So I think that's an area that could be opened up a little bit. Younger people tend not to be hospitalized. Of course, there are a few exceptions. So maybe they need to strategically look at areas rather than have everyone opened up straight away, that they could base it on the information they have so far.
And why are the elderly being so badly affected by this? I know, they're probably frailer, some of them, and maybe they have pre-existing conditions, but is that the reason why proportionately more of them are dying and, are getting sick from this?
I think it's multifactorial. It depends on where they live. If you're a nursing home resident, you're in close contact with not only your colleagues in residence there, but you also have staff coming in and out frequently. Many of them have other illnesses, and the ones that stand out that are associated with this would be high blood pressure, diabetes, and obesity. Would be risk factors for all of that. And, the older we all get, the more likely you are to have one of these conditions. When we grow older, our immune system becomes less strong. Right. And that makes us prone. We've seen that with loads of other infections, that older people are more prone to getting them. So it's multifactorial, and that age is just a number. I've seen 80-year-olds that look like 60-year-olds, and I've seen 55-year-olds that look like 85-year-olds. Mm-hmm. So it is a number. It's our genes. But honestly, the fitter you are, not being obese, they're protective.
There seems to be some suggestion that the warnings that I suppose the HSE has made very public about, it's a fever and it's a cough, but they seem to be getting different symptoms, or they're not as obvious, perhaps, the symptoms that older people were presenting with.
And that is typical of older people presenting with many infections, like urinary tract infections or pneumonias or skin infections. They tend to have fevers less often, and they tend to have symptoms less often. And we've got quite a number of older nursing home residents. One of my colleagues just told me about a 103-year-old nun who was sitting pretty with it and had no problems at all. And I said, well, there you are. That's why she's 103.
Yeah, fair play to her. Let me see, what other questions have we got here now? Why are so many healthcare workers getting it? Is it because they're exposed to more of the virus just in their working environment?
Yeah, I think there's a few reasons. In the beginning, it was mainly travel related. More recently, it's probably a combination of being in a hospital that you're exposed to it, moving, because I come in and out of hospital, so I'm walking, I'm doing what most people that are listening aren't doing. I'm out and about, and then you're meeting with other people, and you come into a hospital. And it was interesting when I came back onto the front line. I was so used to being socially distanced outside, like in the other workplace, and I came into hospital and I said, God, did they not know that social distancing applies here too? It's, you kind of get this bravado, like, well, I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse, and these things don't happen. They tend not to social distance within it, and that's why we got a lot of signage put out in the hospital, so that people actually got the mindset that it applies not only in Tesco, but also in CUH and any other hospital. So I think there are many, it isn't just because you're a healthcare worker, it's because you're moving, you're not doing the social distancing, you're traveling, you're meeting more people with share accommodation. And
I suppose that's been a really scary part of this, is the fact that you're going in there into the unknown and, you know, seeing colleagues potentially on ventilators or who might die. I mean, it seems to be particularly pronounced in the UK, where we're closest to and where we're seeing that happen on a huge scale. But that must be a very difficult working environment.
Yeah, I mean, it's happened, and I've seen it. People getting really sick. My colleagues getting really sick here, and it's the first time in my career that I've actually feared getting something. And I've seen loads of infections. Obviously, we all fear getting cancer, but when it comes to infectious diseases, most of the time you'd say, "Look, I'm recover," or if you got HIV or hepatitis, there's cures for those, or they can be effectively treated. But with this one, it's just that it's unpredictable. How are you going to do? And secondly, you're really sick if you are one of those unfortunate poor people that gets it. And you look at the patient and say, God, that could be me. Literally, that could be me. Contrasting us to the UK rather than comparing us, like our government took this seriously a lot earlier. Our PPE, they have done their best, and I'm on the front line. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But we're in a global market for a scarce resource, and we're a heck of a lot better from a healthcare protection point of view, a healthcare worker, compared to the UK, where I think they feel stranded and at sea.
Somebody's asking about sneezes, and things staying on surfaces. How long do these things hang around on surfaces? And people are worried about their shopping and whether they should be wiping things down.
The evidence shows that up to 3 days, but there haven't been any big outbreaks and people coming back from Tesco, because I think know the shop you're going to, they're well cleaned down. The key thing is when you come home, wash your hands. You could be wiping all these plastic bags and all of that, but realistically, if you wash your hands, that's the simple message that needs to get out there. If you're kind of saying, well, I'm white the newspaper and all of that, like, you'd be doing your head in. And when it really, you read the newspaper, you go off, you wash your hands. That's it. It's hand washing.
And where do you stand on masks? Is it relevant to wear the mask?
There's been a good bit of review on that. Within the hospitals now, they're recommending that both the patients and the healthcare staff, all cleaners, care assistants, wear masks now. But that's because there's evidence of transmission within hospitals. Out in the general public, it's not recommended. And in actual fact, people are putting their hands up to their mouths and changing them and all of that, which probably increases their risk. So as of now, no. I mean, Richard asked me that question, will you bring me a few masks and will I wear them? I said, no, you won't, because that's the guidance. If it changes, of course we should wear them. It's important to remember that masks are a valuable resource and we should really be using them very wisely. And at the moment, the evidence isn't there for the public to use them.
There's been a bit of research about the BCG vaccination, and has it given some sort of innate immunity to perhaps our population, where we've had, I think, since the 1930s when it was introduced here, compared to other countries? Like, is it too early to know if that's a link?
Yeah, like theoretically, a lot of the treatments they've been talking about, like BCG, MMR vaccine, hydroxychloroquine, theoretically they may work, but you absolutely need to have large clinical trials to prove any evidence of protection. Otherwise, they're all little small reports. Even the initial one, hydroxychloroquine, there were only 36 patients on it, and they weren't measuring real outcomes. So what I'd say is that we all hope that there is a treatment and that we find a treatment. But at the moment, there's no evidence, from big clinical trials that anything works. That doesn't mean that they don't work. It just means that they need to be studied properly.
And then I suppose the vaccine is really our great white hope, in terms of that is what's going to be the holy grail, if you like. But it seems that getting a vaccine for a coronavirus is really something spectacular and going to be very, very challenging to achieve.
Yeah, I suppose the coronavirus is one of the viruses that causes the common cold. And if it was straightforward to do, it would have been done because some big company would have made a fortune. It hasn't been done. What I would hope with the amount of resource being put in, and that pharma companies are coming together and collaborating, a number of them, and that with all their scientific expertise, that the hope is that they'll find some aspect of the virus on which they can base a vaccine. So I suppose I'm an optimist in life. I think it hopefully will happen, because that is really the goose that laid the golden egg. I mean, if you develop that, you never have to do the lotto anymore. You'll just have so much money. While it's challenging to do, I'm hopeful it's not impossible.
My money is on Bill Gates. I'm kind of hopeful he might do something first, because I see his foundation are talking about potentially trialing, scaling up and developing maybe 7 vaccines in the hope that 2 of them might be a runner. And as he says himself, you might waste many billions, but it's less than the trillions that they're throwing into the world economies to keep it going. Do you think that's a strategy, or is that
absolutely
optimistic?
Absolutely. I mean, when you're doing research and development on anything, you need to have multiple lines of attack, and that means doing several different vaccines, because their vaccines work and act on different parts of whether it's a virus or bacteria. I think he's absolutely right. If you don't take risks, and if your only outcome is absolute success and you're afraid to progress unless you get success, you have to take risks with this. And if 1 in 10 works, that's all you need.
Coming into the summer, is there any evidence that the virus is the warm weather something that might reduce the spread? Or
yeah, so we know with influenza that it's definitely seasonal, and with influenza it will absolutely go in March and April. That's it. With coronavirus, we don't know. I mean, we do get colds in the summer. My God, I would hope and pray that it could, abate just because of temperature and vitamin D levels. But it's April. We just don't know. Yeah. I suppose it has, like Singapore is always hot and they have a problem there. So I don't know. I wish, but we don't know.
Yeah, sure. Just on the vaccine, how long would it take? I mean, it's not going to happen that quickly.
12 to 18 months minimum. Because what happens is that they need to develop candidate vaccines, then they need to do animal testing, they need to do 3 phases of human testing. First, to make sure that they're safe, whatever about anything else. And then the other parts of it after safety or efficacy, or other words, they're how they work and do they work.
And if they were to develop a vaccine, like how would you go about vaccinating, a global population?
Yeah, well, you would have done it with polio and with smallpox. I mean, smallpox has been eradicated, and the only reason that was eradicated was because of vaccination. Polio, we still see a little bit of outbreak, but very minor. So it's widespread vaccine, and obviously if you could get one that you could just do a drop it up the nose, that would be ideal. Otherwise it's injection.
Okay. And is it the type of thing would have to be mandatory though, because if some people have it and some people don't?
Well, personally I think it should be mandatory, because you're going to have a proportion of the population who are anti-vax. But this is to the benefit of the whole population, particularly those who are vulnerable.
I suppose just going forward, like at the way the hospitals are structured at the moment, you have the COVID part of it where you go in if you have COVID, and then separately there's the everyday hospital functions. But it sounds like those functions are very quiet at the moment, and there seems to be concern that people are not accessing the services for cancer or heart attacks or stroke. That's something that that the public are going to have to be given confidence to do again, aren't they?
Yeah, I suppose, this has caused widespread fear, and understandably so. So people don't want to go to hospitals, number one. Secondly, there had to be reduction in the service within hospitals so that we could set up structures to see COVID patients, because they take a lot longer to see. But I think what happens now, it has to happen now, is that we need to have people regain confidence to come into hospital. We need to prioritize initially those people who really need the screening programs, people with heart problems, diabetes and all of that, to get up and running again. And then plan for the more elective parts of what we do, like routine, hip replacements, for example, would be an elective process. Whereas an emergency would be somebody who's got a blockage in their bowel because of colon cancer. Those surgeries are happening, but we need to plan on how we can have this parallel healthcare world for the foreseeable future. What's that, 9-12 months? But I think we need to be planning for at least that.
Yeah. And just from a professional point of view, I mean, I know it's terrible but I mean, you see the deaths, and it's some days it's 40 deaths a day. I mean, from a professional point of view, this is a new disease, a new virus. Like the opportunities for research, the learning from it. It must be, because it's kind of cutting edge, really, if you're in infectious diseases or at the front line. Is it from somebody in the medical
absolutely
profession?
I mean, the one area that I always had an interest in, because you'll see some people who come in with the very same infection, and one gets better really quickly and the other deteriorates despite having everything done. And a lot of it is how genetically we're made up and how we respond to infection. And sometimes the response is worse than the infection. And that's what's happening in a lot of these patients. It's not the virus, it's the inflammatory response of our bodies to the virus that's causing the problem. And I've absolutely no doubt that if you're looking for any upside in this, is the amount of research and information that research in this area will give us to be able to better treat people and prevent that often inflammatory response. This is the disease that will answer those questions. The comparator would have been HIV/AIDS, which gave us a huge amount of information on transplant medicine, because the way the HIV virus works, it attacks your immune system, a particular part of your immune system, and that's the very same part that after you get a transplant, get put on medications, it also suppresses the same one. So all the information we got from those awful infections AIDS patients used to get, we were able to apply to transplant medicine and prevent a lot of that from happening. Yeah, the silver lining would be the amount of information this is going to give, and there's such a concentration of researchers looking at this. It's fantastic.
And the collaboration across the world seems to be quite unique.
Yeah, even across universities, which is unusual. They're even talking to one another, coming out of their silos. And in this area more than anything, because we're desperate for good news on this, that collaboration rather than competition is absolutely key to giving us quick answers.
So let's be optimistic. What's the best case scenario here? What can happen, and how can people cope with this? And how should we prepare ourselves? Are we talking short term, further lockdowns? Like, when can we realistically look to some form of normality?
I think the first thing I would say is that we need to adapt to a life with COVID. It's not after COVID, it's living with it for a while and changing how we socialize. I think that's going to be a norm for quite a while. The hope would be that a drug will be available to treat those people who get really sick, so that we can offset their need to go to the intensive care unit. And then probably in the more longer term is a vaccine. So there would be 3 steps that I would see happening. I believe that we probably won't be allowed to travel maybe overseas for a while, but I'm only surmising that might be the case. But if we could, get a drug quickly, treat people, and then get the vaccine, they'd be the steps that I would take. But I think we'll be living differently. It happened after 9/11, where we'd lived differently and we adapted to it. Here it's more difficult because it absolutely impacts on every single person, and that's unusual for an infection.